Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we examine the underlying causes of all the dysfunction and polarization in our political system and our government. We intend to educate our listeners and viewers on these causes, and we try to talk about solution sets. We don't want to only talk about problems here. We want to talk about problems. We want to talk about solutions. In our last show, we finished a two-part discussion on campaign finance reform. And if you haven't seen those shows, I certainly welcome you to them. Campaign finance reform is probably the poster child for what people think is the most disruptive element in our political system. And as our guest, we had Peter Wallison, and we talked about his book and some solution sets. After Peter's interview, which again I commend to you, we had an interview with Jeff Pele, who is with Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia is one of our favorite political websites and probably more information than you could ever want to find about how our political system works. And in our interview with Jeff, we were talking about why we don't have competitive races in the general election these days. And Jeff startled me during that interview because he said Ballotpedia's prediction is that in 2014 we may have as few as 30 competitive races. So think about that. There's 435 members of Congress, and they're predicting we may have as few as 30 competitive races. Now, Jeff explains how they define competitiveness, and based upon that, 30 out of 435, which is roughly 7%. So reverse that, and we're talking about perhaps 93% of the current members in Congress, absent retirement or illness or whatever, 93% of the current members of Congress, the incumbents, being reelected in 2014. So this is kind of what we're up against, and you understand how a dysfunctional system can become when you have that type of incumbency. On today's show, we're going to look ahead to redistricting and talk about implications of redistricting on dysfunction and polarization. But before we get there, I want to give you another slant on this lack of competitiveness in Congress and talk about it from another perspective. So what we have here, and I have next to me, is a chart that I've borrowed from the Cook Political Report for 2013. And the title of this, I hope you can read this, is The Incredible Shrinking Swing Seat 1998 to 214. And what the Cook Report has done, and I've borrowed from them, so I want to give them all the credit, is on the left side here, they are showing the number of seats that were held historically by Democrats, Republicans, and then swing seats, the number of seats that were contested, so to speak. So as far back as 1998, this black line here, which is the swing seats, was actually the largest component of Congress. As far back as 1998, there was 164 competitive seats in Congress, 148 fairly solid seats for Republicans, and then 123 fairly solid seats for Democrats. And again, I hope you can see this chart. What they're defining as a Democratic seat is a seat where the Democrat would be expected, based upon polling or whatever their characteristics are or their requirements are, to garner 5% or greater victory margin. Similar for Republicans, 5% or greater victory margin. And they're defining a swing seat as basically a seat where the competitiveness factor is within 5%. I would suggest to you that that might be one of the major differences between Cook and Ballotpedia in how they define competitiveness. But again, starting out 1998, 16 years ago, roughly 7 election cycles for Congress, we actually had a situation where there were more competitive seats than, so to speak, guaranteed incumbent seats. Now what you'll notice is the red line here for Republicans has actually been growing, and you take it out to the prediction for 2014. I don't know if you can see this number. They're predicting that for 2014 we would have roughly 186 virtually guaranteed Republican seats in Congress. If you follow the Democratic line, that also has been steadily increasing. So it's increased from 123 up to a prediction of 2014 of about 159 locked-in Democratic congressional seats in Congress. So the residual of that becomes 90 seats. And you can see how the line for the swing seats has digressed over the years. We started out at that 164 number in 1998. Slowly but surely has been digressing to the fact that We're now looking at 90 competitive seats according to Cook in 2014, 30 competitive seats according to Ballotpedia in 2014. So at the tight end for the Ballotpedia number, you're looking at maybe 7% competitive, and even if you go by the Cook number, you're barely over 20% competitive seats in Congress. So this is part of the problem for dysfunction. This is part of the problem for polarization. We do not have a competitive Congress. One of the reasons we don't have a competitive Congress, and perhaps the number one reason from my perspective we don't have a competitive Congress, is the fact that we have a redistricting that has occurred based upon the 2010 census, and that has driven a very polarized and a Congress, and one that, based upon the maps that have been drawn, does not allow for competitive seats. So what we're going to do today is start another two-part series. Hopefully you'll be with us for both parts. And we're going to examine redistricting. We're going to look at the underlying history of redistricting, the constitutional requirements. Then we're going to advance out to talk about solution sets. Because again, remember, none of the above is about solutions, not just problems, but solutions. And then following that interview, the second segment of the interview on our show, we're going to overlap redistricting and campaigning and citizen lobbying that we've talked about before, and talk about how some of these things are coming together in today's political world. We're very excited today for our first guest, Dr. John Jackson from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. So we really need to do two introductions for this interview. One is to talk a little bit about the great work of the Paul Simon Institute, and the other one is to introduce Dr. Jackson. The Paul Simon Public Policy Institute was founded by Paul Simon. For those of you that aren't familiar with him, he was a two-term senator from Illinois. And when I think of Paul Simon, I always have very fond memories in a few respects. One, he always wore a bow tie. And since I can't even tie a bow tie, I always hold in great admiration anyone that can. But that was his trademark, the bow tie. But Paul was just a classic gentleman. In a world today when we don't have any collegiality and civility in our political world, you can think back to guys like Paul Simon, who no matter how tense things got, was always a gentleman, who always was civil, who always thought to strike compromises. And I think many people in Illinois think of him and have that type of fond memory of him. When he retired, he started the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. And when you look at their webpage, one of the things about it I think is really terrific is it says it wasn't supposed to be a think tank, it was supposed to be a do tank. Their energies were not around necessarily just writing papers and having great thoughts, but their mission was to take their great thoughts and turn them into action. And today's topic is going to be redistricting, and I had the pleasure a year or so ago to sit in on a conference that they hosted, which was, I think, part of their do mission. And that was to talk about who holds the crayons. I thought that was a great topic. I don't know who thought that up, but the image of who holds the crayons for redistricting has been a lasting image for me. Among the other goals and policies of the Institute are to study ethical conduct in government. And of course, in today's environment, studying ethics in government and promoting good ethics in government is as critical as anything we're doing. And they also are there to promote responsible citizenship. And we've talked about that on this program quite a bit, the need for people to get involved in politics, get active, become responsible citizens, step up. And to that end, their focus is the younger population. We talked about voting before and the fact that young people aren't voting today, and young people just are not as active as they should be. So I think those two goals and initiatives of the Institute are very admirable. So I'm obviously a great fan of the Institute. I have many friends there. I'm aware of their great work, and we thank them for making Dr. Jackson available to us today. Dr. Jackson has been a visiting professor with the Institute for some time. And prior to that, he had a distinguished career at Southern Illinois University, and in fact served as the chancellor for a while. I think being chancellor is always one of the most difficult jobs you can have at any university. The buck stops at your desk on every single issue. And I know John had a great career from that and has since been a visiting professor with the Institute. He is an expert on presidential elections, and although we're not going to chat with him today about presidential elections, I think that His knowledge of the political arena is what attracted us to working with John today. And specifically, we're going to talk to him about redistricting and why redistricting is such a critical issue in American politics today. So John, welcome to our show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
And when I was reading your bio, I was interested that they say you work at a summer institute and you work with foreign students that come over to the United States to study our government. So I'm wondering, what do the foreign students think about the American form of government, and in particular how it works in today's environment?
Well, this is a grant we've had from the U.S. State Department for many years, and it's really interesting to see them come, both faculty and students from institutions around the world, coming to the Midwest and learning sort of about the real world of practical politics, Illinois politics, and I think they get a lot of misconceptions, particularly from the coverage they get in their countries of our political process. I think they're always struck by how down-to-earth Americans are, how open and friendly they are, and really how much grassroots participation we have. We take them, for example, to both county government and city council meetings, and real citizens of Carbondale stand up and address the city council and usually complain loudly about something, and so they really think that's quite an eye-opening experience and much more participatory than they expect.
Well, that's a great mission. I think that ties in with the vision of having a do tank, not just a think tank.
That's correct. You have to think in order to do, and we like to think we do some of both, but clearly we're fairly activist and frankly fairly reform-oriented. That's one of the things that brings us to the redistricting topic, because we think it's one of those important items of potential reform in Illinois and in lots of other states that could do some good.
Yeah, how did that issue get in front of the Institute? What caused you to, hone in on the importance of it and to start thinking about solution sets?
You know, Mike Lawrence was our director after Paul Simon died, and Mike was always interested in that. And when David Yepsen came as our current director, he picked up that interest, and we magnified that interest, built on the work that Mike had already done and others of us had been involved with. We had done a good deal of work in Springfield trying to get a bipartisan plan that both sides of the aisle and all four legislative leaders could agree to. That was when Mike was director, and when David came, we continued that work under his leadership. We continued, as you know, with that conference that we held in Springfield. And the point of that was not only to look at the downside of sort of the negative examples, but look at some of the new things that are moving around out there, particularly in some of the other states. And so that's what the conference in Springfield about a year and a half ago was all about.
Yeah, and it was a great conference. When I was preparing for today's interview, I found this really interesting quote. There was an Ohio State Senator by the name of Jeff Jacobson, I guess, and he was working on redistricting in Ohio in 2001. And his quote was, "This is the most fun anyone could have in politics and not go to prison."
We don't really want to go too far down that road in Illinois politics, given our governor's races and outcomes, but we do think it would be a salutary move for Illinois to do redistricting differently. We're not that different from a great number of the other states, and as you probably know, we think, and lots of other experts agree, that the drawing of the districts is at the core of polarization, and the red states and the blue states, of course, are well-known symbols, but there are very deeply red and very deeply blue congressional districts across this country, and that particularly leads to the House being deeply polarized. There are so many deeply red Republican districts on the one side and deeply blue Democratic districts on the other side, that the only thing they really fear in those districts is the primary, And on the Republican side, they fear somebody getting to the right of them, particularly now a Tea Party insurgent candidate, and the comparable fear on the left for the Democrats. And after you win the primary, you're almost assured of election in the general if you're from one of these deep red or deep blue districts. That leaves a very small number of sort of marginal toss-up or competitive districts. And if you don't have very many competitive districts, you don't have much impetus for moderation, for meeting in the middle, for dealing with the other party, and for finding bipartisan solutions. And that's what's been happening in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington. And it happens in a great number of other state legislatures, including the one in Illinois.
Yeah, John, I think you just so eloquently stated something I think about probably on a daily basis, how redistricting is causing all these ripple effects throughout politics, and as you said, the polarization. And I want to drill down and talk about that today, but I don't know if most of my viewers really understand what is redistricting, why we have it, you know, and the background. So really this goes back to the Constitution of the United States, correct?
That is correct. The Constitution requires this every 10 years based on the census, and it's been going on literally since we started in 1790 elections and census of that year. So it goes way back, and it's obviously very important because it's in the Constitution. We often use reapportionment and redistricting interchangeably. So let me start by noting they're related but not quite the same thing. Reapportionment is a federal function where the U.S. House has to be reapportioned according to the state's total population. And so the number of seats a state gets in the House is dependent on its population. We had 20 in Illinois. We now have 19 as a result of the 2010 census. Once that number is derived, then there are two redistricting processes. One is to divide up the congressional boundaries of the congressional districts. The other is to divide up the state boundaries of both the state Senate and the state House districts, and that all has to be driven by population. And in essence, while there is some variation here, that population, particularly at the federal level, has to be equal for each of those congressional districts and very near equal for each of the House and Senate districts at the state level. But that's redistricting as opposed to reapportionment.
And that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So reapportionment, basically, as you said, there's 435 members of Congress, and the population of the United States is, what, 350 million today?
A little less than that, but that number has been fixed, the 435,
right,
since legislation in 1910. I think it's maybe about 320 according to the most recent one. And so you just simply do the math and you come up with 710,000 round numbers for a congressional district.
Right, and then you have to apportion that to the states. So Illinois has, what, 12 or 13 million people,
Right.
and you have to divide that by this 700 and some thousand dollar,
Right.
not dollars, 700 and some thousand person number, and you come up with the number of congressional seats. And then, as you said, the numbers don't come out totally perfect every time. So sometimes there's a push and a pull between how many states can pick up a congressman or woman and how many might lose, correct?
That's exactly right. There's a lot of conflict over that because there's been conflict partisan based over the census. The U.S. Constitution requires enumeration, which the court has held to be count heads. Many people think we miss an awful lot of people, particularly in the cities, and that the urban areas are basically underrepresented as a result of that, but that's gotten to be a very partisan issue. But at any rate, when you get that number, as in the case of Illinois, we had to lose one, and so you have to take 20 former districts down to 19. You have to redraw the map.
Yeah, and lately it's been the Sun Belt that's been picking up. California picks up, Texas picks up, Florida, because the people are moving there.
That's correct.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Okay.
well, no, not North Dakota. North Dakota got population, but it's the fastest growing, but the very small states are kind of an exception to the rule. The lowest six have less than a full congressional district, but they're guaranteed of one by the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the general framework. We go back to the Constitution, either the U.S. Constitution or various state constitutions to describe the process. And then on top of that, we had the Voting Rights Act that passed to try and deal with protecting minorities. So how does that work?
Well, that's a very complicated factor, and it's complicated by the subsequent decisions by the Congress, Voting Rights Act of 65, then later amended and then interpreted by the courts, means that we have a number of what are called majority-minority districts. That is to guarantee under the 65 Voting Rights Act that minority voting power will not be diluted by dividing them up as we remap. And so we have, since the 1990 census, struggled with creating those majority-minority districts first. And you have to start with the Voting Rights Act, and you have to start with creating those, particularly in big cities such as Chicago or Denver, for example, to take care of that consideration. It then got all tangled up in this most recent decision by the Roberts Court, where they took away the pre-clearance by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice had earlier had to pre-clear anything that appeared to dilute the voting rights of minorities. That is now gone. It's perhaps a little less complicated than it used to be. But the long and short is you have to start with creating whatever your population warrants of minority protected districts, translation, African American and Hispanic in a number of states.
Right, and John, this majority-minority concept, please explain it, but my understanding is that you can't just draw the district so that there's, let's say, 51% minority in that district to try and make that competitive. You actually have to have more like 60 or 70% minority to strike the proper balance.
That's exactly right. The court has wavered over where that line is, and there's not a bright line, but they've intimated that about 60% will get you out from under their purview. It seems to be about there because turnout levels and percentages tend to be less in the minority community. One of the interesting political side effects of this, though, has been minority communities and the Republican Party have joined forces often in many states, and this has become a Republican-minority kind of coalition where minorities want as many of those districts as they can get, and so do the Republicans. Because then if you pack more of the minorities into those districts, you get a heavily Democratic or heavily blue district, but that also takes them out of suburban districts and thus makes less competitive places around Atlanta, for example, and places around the edges of Chicago, for example. So it's politics makes strange bedfellows kind of phenomenon.
I love that. I love that phrase. In fact, my next book, the subtitle is "Politics Makes Strange Bedfellows." So one more thing before we move on to how redistricting works. Let's talk a little bit about gerrymandering. At the end of the day, once you've taken care of the minority populations, it's okay to basically draw districts to protect politicians and political parties, correct?
I'd say that is the essence of the Supreme Court's position. A lot of people don't like that and don't agree with it. And in some states, that's not the law. In Iowa, for example, that would not be the case. But certainly in most states it is. In Illinois it is. The court has wavered on what they call a partisan or a political gerrymander. They recognize the possibility. They say we don't know exactly what the definition of a partisan gerrymander is. We will allow partisanship to be one consideration, but not the only consideration. But in essence, yes, you can take care of the incumbents, which also means taking care of partisan considerations on both sides of the aisle.
So each state, after the census, is now going to have to do their redistricting. And
Right.
generally, this would be the work of the legislature, is it in most states, correct?
In most states, in the first cut, yes.
So
And
what does the legislature do? They get the census data, and then they get these, what, sophisticated computer programs, and they literally start carving up the world.
absolutely, there's a whole cottage industry of consultants that you can hire and that legislators do hire that will come in and help you overlay the political map down to the precinct level with the total state census and with every variation you can think of. And the computer is so big and so brainy, it can think of virtually infinite numbers of possibilities of way to put this together to advantage whoever is drawing that particular map and instructing the computer.
Yeah, how much of the issue of redistricting do you think ties into the fact that we have these amazing computer capacities now that maybe 30, 40 years ago you didn't have the data, you didn't have the capability. Now you can do this with such precision, you can literally go on a block and put one house in and take the next house out and put another house in. That sophistication has got to be weighing on the results here.
I think that's exactly right, and it is helping to drive now the increased polarization of both state legislatures as well as U.S. Congress. The technology is just amazing, and the census data is so precise, and the political data are so rich that you can come up with incredible variations.
So when they start to work on redistricting, the first step obviously is to gather the data, and then they and by the way, all this is happening in a smoke-filled back room somewhere, right? The typical political characterization.
One blue smoke filled and one red smoke filled. They're both running their computer as fast and hard as they can.
Right. Although not in most of the Midwestern states, including Illinois, they're dominated by one party. So the party that's the majority is essentially controlling this entire process.
Well, that's ultimately true, but not in the initial stage. Both parties are going to work very hard to get their map drawn and out there, even in Illinois, because you have the option of the legislature can draw the map as they did in 2010, and the Democrats dominated. But in 2000 and in 3 of our other elections since the 1970 Constitution, we've had a stalemate in Illinois. The partisan maps both then went to what's called the tiebreaker vote, and you get to pick a name out of the hat, literally, and that tiebreaker is going to be either the Democratic map or the Republican map, often as then modified by the courts. So even the minority party has a big stake in getting their map out there.
That's a good point. The minority party wants to have a map ready in case they get into the game.
Absolutely,
Okay.
and there again in Illinois and lots of other states, that's where the Republicans do common cause with various minority leaders in either the African American or Hispanic communities, because as in 1990, for example, they made common cause.
Those are those strange bedfellows you were talking about, right?
Right.
Well, John, just to show you how time flies, this is going to be the end of our first interview and part of this 2-part series. So thank you for your help today, and we look forward to bringing you back on our next show as we drill down on some solution sets for redistricting. Thank you.
Okay, glad to do it.
Welcome back. I certainly hope you enjoyed that segment with Professor Jackson. We're going to digress here for a minute and move away from redistricting. I was doing some reading in preparation for today's show, and I ran across a graph that, quite frankly, has me stumped. And we're going to talk a little bit about how people vote, not the number of people voting, but how people vote, and the concept of ticket splitting. I'm going to talk to you today about something that most people don't talk about. I'm talking about how I voted historically. I've been voting for about 40-some years now, and I have never voted a straight ballot. So for those friends of mine that always thought they could predict how I would vote, I'm telling you right now, I've never voted a straight ballot. And there's a few reasons for that. I like to think I'm a student of each ballot, and I'm hard-pressed to think that even if I favored one party, every one of their candidates is always going to be exceptional to the extreme. And most of the time, there is an exceptional candidates on both sides of the ledger. Another reason I've historically split my ballot is I think one of the worst forms of government is when one party controls all of the seats of the legislature, not all of the seats, but controls the legislature majority and holds the executive branch. I think we have a system of balance in powers, but I also like to think that the system of balance in powers should be enhanced by ticket splitting and having multiple party government. So that's just my personal preference. But I ran across this chart and it stumped me a bit, and I thought we'd talk about it on the show and see if we could draw some conclusions and maybe throw it out to the audience to see if you could help me figure some things out here. So I have with me a chart, and I apologize. Again, this is my inner Lou Dobbs. I've kind of handcrafted this chart on my whiteboard here. And this is a chart that represents the voting pattern going back to 1952 all the way up to 2008. And I apologize, I need to attribute this chart to someone, and I forgot the attribution. So I'll add that at the end of the show. But what this chart shows is it starts on the left side here with the percent of people that are splitting their ballot. When they're voting, they're splitting their ballot. They're not voting a straight party ticket. And the range on this side runs from 10% to 30%. So the high water mark here is a little over 30% who would have split their ballot. And then along the bottom here, and I hope you can see this, is the range of elections, again, all the way from 1952 up to 2008. So you can see that in the early 50s, there was very little ticket splitting. I don't know what the historical implications of that are, but roughly 52, 56, 60, about 15% of the people were splitting their ballot, which conversely means that 80 or 85% of the people were voting a straight party ballot. And this particular set, and I should point out, is distinguishing between the presidential vote and the congressional vote. It's not looking downstream to state elections or local offices. It's talking about splitting between presidential and Congress. So anyway, we've had very little ticket splitting here. All of a sudden, we have a relative skyrocketing in ticket splitting, and I'm not much of a historian in terms of, again, the politics of situations, but you're looking at the late 60s, early 70s, you're looking at the Vietnam War, obviously a very contentious period in our country's history, and maybe there were some reasons at that time that there was some ticket splitting. But once you get from the early 70s all the way down to 2008, it's pretty much a downhill all the way. And that's where I'm stumped. I'm stumped as to why we went from this environment of heightened ticket splitting, if that's the right way to phrase it, to getting down to very little ticket splitting again, probably in the range of 15, 18%. Now, one of the reasons that I have concluded this may be happening relates back to what we talked about in another show. We have a significant portion of the population that doesn't vote anymore. They're disenfranchised. They don't show up to vote. They don't show up to register. If you'll remember the statistics we looked at, 30-some%, I think, of the population doesn't even bother to register. And then there was another 15 or so percent that didn't show up to vote in the presidential election. So we had a huge portion of the population that could have voted that wasn't voting. So what I'm thinking is happening is that a big chunk of the population is checking out, and I think the part that's checking out are the independents, perhaps the people that might have split their ballots, the people that don't have party affiliations. I think they're checking out, and I think the residual of that is we're left with voters who are very strong supporters of their party, and they're going to the poll and they're not splitting their ticket. They're voting for president and Congress, one party, and that they're very happy with that result. So I thought I'd just throw this out to the viewers. It stumped me a bit, stumped me as to why we hit this high water mark and why we've gradually worked our way down to where we were in the 50s again, why we don't have ticket splitting. So think this through for me, if you will, and then perhaps write to me and let me know what's going on. If you'll recall, the way to contact us through the show for None of the Above is to write to us at info@noneoftheabove.us. info@noneoftheabove.us. And there is also the Third Party 101 website, which you can find at www.thirdparty101.com, www.thirdparty101.com. So I'm interested in your thoughts. This one stumped me a little, and I have to tell you, it's not very satisfying to see the way we are now voting, because if nothing else, we are now left with a polarized electorate. Our next guest is Sarah Rozier. Sarah is another one of our Ballotpedia All-Stars. And Sarah is the Congress Project Director. Congress is a project, so trying to be the director of that has to be fairly daunting. And one of the issues that Sarah has been tracking is this notion that although we may not be seeing a competitive level at the general elections, we're seeing an increasing level of competitiveness at the primary elections, particularly the congressional primary elections. So Sarah, tell us, what does it mean to be the Congress Project Director?
So on Ballotpedia, we've been tracking incumbents and candidates since we started in 2012. Not only candidates and incumbents now, we're also starting to track issues and trends that we're seeing in both elections and in the actual bills and the happenings of Congress themselves.
And one of the things you've decided to track is this notion of competitiveness.
Yes.
Right. So what kind of data do you look at for something like that?
So for this study, we looked at any incumbent who was facing a primary challenge. So we separated it out from, if there was a Republican incumbent, we didn't really look at the Democratic primary. We really focused on whether or not those incumbent congressmen and women were facing primary challenges.
And what is the data telling you?
Of the 393 incumbents that ran for re-election in 2012, only 192 actually faced a challenge, which is less than 50%. Only 48.6% faced no primary challenge.
And you said, is most of this on the Republican side, or is it mixed, Republican and Democrat?
The top 10 who actually did face a primary, who came the closest, which was a margin of victory of under 10 percentage points, 7 of the 10 were Republican primaries. So we definitely are seeing increased competition on the Republican side.
So when you define competitiveness, you're not just looking at whether or not someone has an opponent, you're looking at whether or not they actually have a meaningful opponent, I take it.
Yes, we looked at both factors, and only, 7.69% of those who even faced a primary challenge, those were the only amount of people who were under 10% or less.
But even though you may not see a lot of challenges, you're saying there are an increasing number of challenges. That the number of challenges, as bad as the number is, it's actually getting a little better.
Yes.
So what do you attribute that to?
We're seeing, it is interesting because 2010, despite the Tea Party wave, despite the excitement around primaries and, anti-establishment rhetoric, we saw 66 less primaries in 2010 than we did in 2012, which means that this new batch of congressmen who were elected in 2010 are keeping up more with the scorecards. They're looking at more, what are the interest groups kind of pressuring us to do? So there's an increased focus on, all right, how do we really stick with our base to make sure that any primary challenge is met with, well, hey, look at how I voted on the shutdown, or hey, look at my civil liberties votes, or stuff like that. So we're definitely seeing an increase of mindfulness of what the base is feeling.
And how much of the increased competition, to the extent there is such a thing, do you think is a result of the redistricting?
Well, we are noticing that the big races are happening now in the primaries. We just released a battleground study that shows that only 29 districts will actually really be competitive in the 2014 elections. So that means that the majority, by far, of districts, over 400 districts, will really be decided in the primaries. And I think voters are starting to see that the only way to make a real true change is going to be through the primary system.
Well, that's a staggering number, or a frightening number. So what you're saying is you are predicting, however you go about predicting, that of all the congressional races next year, and just to remind our viewers, every congressperson has to run every 2 years, correct? It's not like the Senate. So every congressperson will be up for re-election, 435 if my memory serves me correctly. Of 435 possible elections, only 29 are going to be competitive in the general election?
Yes, that is what we concluded. We did a very broad study on lots of different factors. We included other third-party groups such as Cook, who is famous for their PVI and percentage of voter index, where they predict their districts. We also used presidential margin of victories, which have really shown a difference between 2008 to 2012. We can see how the district is trending after the redistricting happened in 2010. We also used incumbency rates, since incumbency, we call it king. Incumbency is king in these House races. You're much more likely to be winning a race if you've been in there a long time. So when we threw all these factors together, we ranked each district of how competitive it truly was. And we found that compared to what other places are saying, really, unless something catastrophically changes these numbers, only 29 really have a true chance of changing hands.
Well, I know we came today to talk about primaries, but that number for generals is just frightening. It's just very frightening.
It is.
So going back to the primaries, and again, you said there's an increasing level of competition. Historically, it's said that during an off presidential year, the next year is an off presidential election year, that there are more changes in Congress, more shifts in Congress. So how important is it, and what do you predict would be the result of being an off-year election in terms of this primary competitiveness? How do you see that playing out?
I think the midterms elections were more able to be swung before redistricting. However, the House is already a Republican majority, and normally midterms are really reflected on the popularity of the president. So because Obama's popularity rate is lower because of the Obamacare and the recent news surrounding that, there's a chance for Republicans to pick up a few more seats. I don't see a wave happening in either way for the House. However, the Senate will be interesting in 2014. There are 33 regular election seats up and 2 special elections that will also happen on November 4th. And those definitely have more of a chance of swinging one way or another. There are quite a few blue senators in very red states. So, for example, West Virginia, Senator Rockefeller is retiring. So that'll now be an open seat that has the possibility of a Republican pickup. There will also be Senator Kay Hagan in North Carolina. That's one example of a Democratic senator in a pretty Republican state. So I think the swing may happen more in the Senate than in the House this election cycle.
So you mentioned there's an incumbent who won't be running who's a Democrat. Does that predict, from your perspective, does that necessarily predict that the Democrats will have a competitive primary, or not necessarily?
Right now, that one's not looking too competitive. It's been interesting to try to track some of these open seats in red states. Montana's another example. Senator Max Baucus is retiring, and we've seen a little bit of confusion thus far in the Democratic primary as to who's going to step up and run, because they're going to be such hard-fought battles.
Now, one of my personal theories that we're going to investigate on this program, hopefully quite a bit, is the notion that we need competitiveness and probably need a third party to make things competitive. Now, the Tea Party is not a third party. They may become one. They're not one now. How does the advent of the Tea Party add to this new layer of competitiveness?
I think as we saw the wave of new members come in 2012, there has been this more of, all right, we're going to key vote this certain bill. So the one example I'll always go back to is the shutdown. You had non-establishment, non-leadership members crying, shut it down, shut it down. Heritage Action got involved in the fray, and normally they were less to the right than other Senate conservative funds and Club for Growth, but they were even screaming, shut it down, shut it down. So it was interesting to see how the members were responding to that, because if they weren't voting, there were calls for, all right, who can we get to challenge Cornyn, for example, in Texas? He didn't vote for cloture, or he did vote for cloture. How can we how can you really stick it to him after he didn't follow his constituents' votes and cries for shutting it down, kind of thing. I think we'll see more of that as we get closer to the election. There's going to be a pretty big divide within the Republican Party over issues like that. And this recent trend of, your member only voted 75% of the time with the Tea Party wing will definitely come into play for primaries going forward.
Do you also see perhaps that pendulum within the Republican Party swinging back a bit? So in other words, let's say a proponent of an advocate of the Tea Party principles was elected last time. Do you see the more moderate element of the Republican wing wanting to now run someone in the primary to more or less take back their turf?
I know that's come up a few times. Justin Amash in Michigan will be facing a more establishment, more moderate challenger. I don't see how much traction that's going to pick up because so much of the pressure in primary is coming more from the further right than from the middle. I know there was talk of, in Indiana, for example, Murdoch lost in the general election after ousting Lugar in the primary, and there's calls from Karl Rove types about this is why the Tea Party can't have nice things kind of deal there. But I don't see more moderate candidates getting as much traction in a primary against a Tea Party, or just because the incumbency, they're now considered the incumbents, and they are giving a lot of these constituents what they're looking for.
Well, based upon your data, I think there's some hope in the fact that there is some increased competitiveness. But I think what I'm also hearing from you is there's a ceiling there. I mean, we are not headed to an environment of a competitive political world, just a marginally better competitive world.
Right. It's really scary to think that Congress approval ratings are hitting record lows, but people are so willing to say, no, not my congressman. My congressman isn't the fault. It's District 5 or whatever it may be. It's never people's own congressman, but really, if anybody's looking for fresh blood and they look at the approval ratings, it's still pretty dismal.
Yeah, that's the classic explanation. It's Congress is bad, but my congressperson's okay.
Yeah.
Sarah, so you run the Congress Project for Ballotpedia. For our listeners, if anyone wants to become active, drill down and get more information on what you're doing, study this issue better, how do they get to Ballotpedia? How do they track what you're doing?
So you'll just go to ballotpedia.org, and on the homepage you'll be able to click on the Congress link, and that'll take you to all things Congress. We have a myriad of studies up now, links to any election you'd want to see in 2014. We're really picking up our coverage at this point. So feel free to contact me. You can do that through Ballotpedia as well.
And again, all your information will be continuously updated, so whether it's heading into the primary or the general, they can go to your site and get up-to-the-minute data on the races, who's running, etc.
Yes. Yep.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Always appreciate the insights of the people from Ballotpedia. Thank you. Our next guest is Richard Winger. For those of you who've already visited with us on None of the Above, Richard is one of our regular contributors. Richard is the nation's leading expert on ballot access, a very obscure area of politics, but one that's very important. If you can't be on the ballot, you can't run for office. You can't run for office, you can't make a difference. So Richard has been educating us on some of the issues related to ballot access. He's the publisher of Ballot Access News. So Richard, what's going on in the world of ballot access today?
Well, I'd like to talk about the nation's absolutely worst ballot access law, and that's Georgia's law on how minor party and independent candidates get on the ballot for U.S. House of Representatives. It is so bad, no minor party has been on the ballot in a regularly scheduled election for U.S. House in Georgia since 1942. Now, what happened back then? In 1943, the current law was written. So it's 70 years old, and it is so restrictive. It has never been used by a minor party candidate in 70 years, and it's only been used once by an independent, and it's been made worse since that happened. What Georgia does is requires a minor party or independent candidate for U.S. House to collect between 15,000 and 20,000 valid signatures. Every sheet has to be notarized. You only have a limited amount of time to collect the signatures. And in practice, there's very tough finding good places to petition in Georgia. So the net result is a total Democratic-Republican monopoly for this most important office.
So, Richard, in Georgia, if I was running as a Republican or a Democrat, how many signatures would I need?
0.
0?
Yes. They just pay a filing fee to get on the ballot, in the primary ballot.
Yeah, I find that amazing. Well, thank you for your insight. These are so valuable to have people understand how our system gets gamed, and particularly in the state of Georgia, they don't have access to any real third-party or minority views, and probably not going to change anytime soon, is it?
We're always hopeful. You know, if the courts did their job, this law would have been struck down long ago, because the U.S. Supreme Court has said 3 times if a ballot access law is so tough that no one ever uses it, it's probably unconstitutional. But we tell this to the judges, the federal judges in Georgia. And the last time was a case called Caulfield versus State of Georgia. And the 11th Circuit said, well, that's true, but maybe that's because nobody's tried. Well, people have tried, but at that point, it was too late to introduce new evidence into the record. If we'd known that would have influenced them, we would have put in evidence about all the people who've tried and failed. They should have remanded it, but they didn't. So the case was over.
Richard,
we asked the Supreme Court to review it, but they wouldn't.
Richard, thank you again as always. Just real quickly here for our viewers, how do they find you and how do they find Ballot Access News if they want to subscribe?
Just Google Ballot Access News. And if you want to take it in the mail, it's only $16 a year for 12 issues. All my contact information is on the webpage, Ballot Access News.
What a great value. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Stephen.
Well, we certainly hope you enjoyed today's program. As always, our intention is to both educate and entertain, and hopefully you came away with a new appreciation for redistricting, among other things. I promised during the middle segment that I would give you the attribution for the whiteboard chart we had, and that was from data produced by the American National Election Studies. I've seen this same graph in a few places, and I've seen 2 versions. Obviously, the version that talks about the amount of splitting, and then the reverse version of this, which talks about the percentage of straight party voting. Anyway, we want to tip our hat again and thank the American National Election Studies for that data. As you know, with every program, we have a homework assignment, and today's homework assignment is I want to see if I can get you engaged, not just to get active in politics, but to start reading about politics. Maybe we could find 15, 20 minutes each week that you'll dedicate to reading about politics, and not just reading the local paper. I think we need to branch out a bit and get a flavor for national politics. I know at the national level, I try to balance things out a bit. I read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and balance them out. Usually they've got a little right-left, conservative, liberal thing going there. I think The Economist is a terrific magazine that gives, quite frankly, a global perspective. And there's a series of periodicals out there, you might find, and also books on our website, www.thirdparty101.com. I've got a series of book reviews that I've written. And to that end, for those of you that read interesting, fascinating books on politics, why don't you shoot those to us? If you want to include a review, we'll post them on the website. But just to get people reading and branch out between, again, from the local paper, and looking for a national perspective, international perspective, just try and pick up and get educated. It's very important that we're not only active, but educated. Because at some point, as we always talk about, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.